Some cities are more open for business to LGBTQ plus people, and some are not.
Cities that are tend to be more economically dynamic, innovative, attract higher skilled workers, and have a higher quality of life.
But which cities are more open to LGBTQ plus people and which aren't?
Find out today on Career Money episode number 368 when we talk with George Perlov of Open for Business, a coalition of leading global companies dedicated to LGBTQ plus inclusion.
Let's get on with the show.
Welcome, George Perlov, to the Career Money podcast. We're excited to have you.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. So can you, to give our listeners and David and me as well, a rundown of what is Open for Business and what you're all about?
Sure. Open for Business was founded about 7 years ago in London. It's a UK-based charity that's a coalition of 35 plus global corporations that are committed to LGBT inclusion around the world.
Nice. Very important business. Yeah.
So it's a charity that's working at the corporate level, right?
Exactly. We're set up as a charity, but our coalition that we formed over the years represents companies from Google to Microsoft to IKEA to CNA to a whole host of BCG, McKinsey, Accenture, a whole host of big names, corporate names that are known around the world.
Nice.
I will say, John and I just coming off of being at Out and Equal here in the U.S., their summit, it's again a reminder to us about the power that corporations have to move the needle significantly when it comes to LGBT rights, especially in the workplace.
Exactly. And I think, we see, especially from companies that are from the US, UK, Northern Europe, there's a huge commitment to LGBT inclusion and a huge commitment to taking action and speaking out and advocacy. What we find is often harder, and a lot of the work that we do is based in places that's really hard for queer people. And by the way, I'm using the term queer people for LGBTQ plus interchangeably, so just in case there's a question of what I mean. But places like Poland, places like Kenya, places like the Caribbean, where we have colleagues and programs set up, it's a lot harder for companies to be outspoken on issues. And that's really a lot of the work that we try to do at the local level.
Gotcha. And so you reached out to us. Actually, Paul Donovan, who was on the podcast before, he made an introduction to us, said that Open for Business does this important study every couple of years. He thought that we would be intrigued by it, and he happened to be correct. We were very intrigued by it. This is the kind of thing that really gets us excited. So every couple of years, it seems like every 2 years, Open for Business does what's called its cities ratings. And the Open for Business City Ratings 2022 was recently published. Why do you conduct this study every year? What is the mission of this study specifically?
Well, the study really is the first of its kind in this area. There are a lot of studies that talk about what cities are most economically viable. And there are a lot of studies that look at where's the best place for LGBT people to live or work or travel, but we've never brought them together. And that's really what Open for Business is about, is looking at a number of indicators about cities and their competitiveness, and at the same time, looking at how welcoming are they for LGBT people broadly, and how strong are the rights of LGBT people in these places. And it just brings, for us, it really brings a message of what we're trying to do, the economic case for LGBT inclusion, to a much broader audience around the world. And that's really why we started this about 4 years ago, and then have been doing it every 2 years since.
Yeah, we just think that's so important. We've been talking more about that on the podcast, that yes, there's a moral case and there's a human rights case for LGBTQ inclusion, but we also think there's a strong economic argument for it, and more organizations and studies of various sorts are really supporting that. And we'll dive into that a little bit later. I don't want to jump the gun, but we just think that's a really powerful message, especially coming from two money nerds, right? We think it's important to have the underlying economic case, because I think that for a lot of the folks who aren't necessarily inherently supportive of our community. They tend to be very focused on economics. And if we can sort of bridge that gap and show that there's actually an economic case, a quality of life case in the city that you live in, economic mobility, access to good products and services and innovation, then that's speaking sort of their language as well. But I'll hold off a little bit.
Right. Well, I'll
Well,
also,
exactly. And I think I was just going to say, oh, just to that point, I was just going to say is that, yes, exactly, that's it. Because the business leaders understand that they make their decisions based on numbers and the economic case, as do policymakers, the mayors, and the governors and others in the region are all looking at these issues very carefully because they realize that there is an impact on the bottom line. But of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, number one, we support all of the local LGBT NGOs in the regions where we work, and they are really our guide for how we should be supporting them. But for most of them and the businesses that we talk to in the region, they really are supportive of the work that we're doing, and because it does add an argument that's not been made before or not been made well enough before.
Wonderful.
And I'll also add that in the queer community and for LGBT folks, there seems to be a lot of appetite for where should I go, right? We know that city lists or country lists are oftentimes very searched for LGBT folks. Our Gay Cities article is our #1 performing article on the Debt Free Guys, and it's interesting that paired with something like this allows people to see maybe where the best competition is, right? It's not just for those of us who are looking to be more mobile and maybe go where we want to get a better quality of life, but it's also maybe competition for these cities to look at and say, how do we up our game to attract the best kind of candidates for the companies that want to come here? You want to move up in this list, you want to be more inclusive, you're probably then it's going to be easier for you to lure a company like Google or Microsoft or ABB, somebody like that. Bringing these companies in is a little bit easier when you can say we rank really well on lists like this.
Exactly. And even, when companies are thinking about either expanding their operations or moving their headquarters or making these kinds of decisions, these are the kinds of things we know that they're taking into account. I think Amazon, in fact, looked at that very carefully in the US a few years ago when they were relocating and made the decision to go to New York. And I think there were a few other places that were in consideration. And they said, this is the reason why, because there's such a strong correlation with LGBT inclusion and innovation and creativity and all of these other things that businesses, want, where businesses want to be. They want to be in that kind of environment.
Exactly. All right. So let's get some definitions out of the way. What exactly does it mean to be open for business?
So our rankings go from A to D, basically, and showing that, and similar to the ratings that the ratings agencies use for stocks and bonds. And so you want to be like a AAA, yes. So AAA cities, that we see around the world, like New York, like Amsterdam, are the ones that score highest both on competitiveness, economic competitiveness, and LGBT inclusion. And inclusion, we look at both sort of rankings on social inclusion. So from studies that people have done, are LGBT people seen as being well received in these countries? And secondly, on the rights, are in terms of marriage rights, ability for trans people to change their name, get legal recognition. If there's a ban on conversion therapy, things like that. Those are the kinds of things that we look at. And so cities that do really well on both of those areas are we considered open for business. And those, and then we go down, quite a ways down to the bottom of the list, which is where, typically it's very low ranking on economically and a very low ranking on LGBT issues. And there's definitely a correlation between those two things as well.
That is a very striking correlation. It does seem just the less inclusive. But then when you start to see cities being less and less inclusive of LGBTQ people, you also notice that there's a parallel with women's rights and other minority rights, and then economics seems to be correlated. It's hard to say that there's not a causation there because there seems to be so strongly correlated, but it's very apparent.
Right.
Yeah, we haven't done data to show like a full causation, which, as you know, is really much more involved. But there's so much data that just shows the relationships here. And just to your point too, what's also interesting is that there are a few outliers in this as well. So, for example, cities that do really well economically, but are really poor on LGBT issues. And just as an example, you can look at a lot of the cities in the Middle East for that right now. And maybe a lot of people are looking at Doha and Qatar because the World Cup, as we know, is heading there this week or next week. And so I think there's a lot of attention on cities like that, but we realize those cities are never going to raise their rankings.
Right.
Unless they change the kind of attitude and beliefs and barriers that exist now for LGBT people. Similarly, Singapore is sort of in that category as well. It's never going to get to that top ranking, although I mean there have been recently some movement there. But that just gives a flavor of some of the outliers that are in the report.
Right. So just to clarify, I think one of the important things to remind folks is that when we're looking at these cities in this list, this isn't necessarily an affordability, a place where it would be easy for me to move there. It's an economic viability, right? So it's the kind of place where businesses themselves will do well, and if you're wanting to, I guess, as an individual, climb the ranks of corporate America or corporate globally, these are probably cities where you're going to find headquarters and large organizations that would be much more, you'd have much more likelihood of being able to do that.
Exactly. It is a business focused index. And just in terms of the US, for example, we have a limit of 10 cities, per country. And that's the US has that because of just the size, that number of cities included in it. So it's not a complete, it's 145 cities. So it's not every city around the world. It would take a lot of more energy and time and commitment to develop that kind of report.
Yeah, we were at dinner last night with a close friend of ours, and we were talking about how we were going to do this interview, and he immediately asked, we recently moved to Toledo, Ohio, and he's like, well, how does Toledo rank on the list? And we're like, oh, well, no, it's not on the list at all because it's not one of the premier U.S. cities.
But one of the things about the index that's interesting and what we want companies to do, and especially their employee resource groups, is to be able, in whatever city they're in, is to start to look at, how well their city scores on some of these topics, and where there might be opportunity, especially on the LGBT side, to push up the rankings a little more in the future. I mean, we do see this as a tool for growth for this, for cities and for companies to use.
Yeah, it's a great example for them to use, right? Especially if they're trying to be competitive on other things like the HRC Corporate Equality Index, using these kinds of this as a tool to say, are we doing as well as other corporations in these other cities?
Exactly. Everyone likes a list.
Exactly. Especially this time of year, right? So what is, from your perspective personally, and maybe as an organization, what are the biggest surprises that came to you from the study this year?
Well, I think it's been a hard year. I mean, between a lot of attacks on democracy overall, and I think that's where we see a lot of these social inclusion scores being hit. I think we've had a lot of attacks on democracy, even in places like the United States, which has sort of been a beacon in the past. But we've seen, even on Transparency International's list, it's beginning to slip a bit. And so a lot of the rights, we see the huge issues now on trans inclusion and transparenting and all of that kind of stuff has really shown up in this year's report. And we've seen that in the US, we've seen that in the UK. and other places that would surprise you in some instances. But I think there have also been some really like wonderful little surprises in places that you wouldn't expect. In fact, for example, Bangalore in India, which is a very big technology hub, now has a whole innovation center there, which we think is really terrific. And they've also taken a lot of actions around LGBT anti-discrimination, which we think is just amazing as well.
Oh, nice.
And what the point there too to say is that cities are often much more ahead of their state and national governments on these areas. Cities can really take big steps forward. I think we see that often in the U.S. in like San Francisco, for example, what they've been doing around car emissions and things like that. And we see the same here with LGBT issues as well, that cities often take really strong stances. A number of the cities in Latin America have also, Santiago, Mexico City, and some others have taken steps where they're allowing same-sex marriage, for example, or like partner adoptions or things like that, that really are really big steps for what we consider developing countries in many ways. So it's super exciting to see these actions happening right now.
I think one of the things that is, this might be a reminder to us, those of us who live in the States, that we oftentimes have been, in many cases, been the leader in LGBT rights being pushed forward, and other people in other countries have been wishful and hoping, right? And that would happen. And maybe this is an opportunity for us to say, well, the progress is happening. Maybe it's not happening right in front of us right here, but there is still progress happening worldwide. And that's what we need. We need it to happen worldwide. We can't just have it happen here in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was just in. We have as I mentioned, we have a program in Poland, and I was just in Warsaw a couple of weeks ago. I've been going fairly often, and I'm very bullish on Poland to make some big changes. And I went to a gay LGBTQ black tie business dinner sponsored by NatWest called the Diamond Awards there a couple of weeks ago. And I mean when from the news that many people outside of Poland hear about LGBTQ free zones and all of this oppression, there's really at the same time a lot of very positive movement on the opposition and the liberal side of Poland. So I'm really very optimistic that we're going to see some changes there in the coming year.
Yes, it did strike me as very interesting to see some of the progress. Countries like or cities like Nairobi, we're seeing progress. Kenya's seeing progress as well. In fact, they're including intersex people in their national census. So it was sort of great to see some of that progress. But
and I think we can. Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say about Kenya, we actually it's also where we have an active program, and our colleague in Nairobi has been working for the last 3 years to see some push here. And I think we're seeing, it's exciting because we are beginning to see this movement. It's still, not ranked. It's it's ranked fairly low compared to other cities, but still it's little pieces of movement like this, which then lead to the change in attitudes, which then leads to the legislative changes, and we've been pushing for decriminalization there, for the last 3 years too, and will be a huge step forward if we can get to that place.
And progress is progress.
Right.
It was also striking to me. The word COVID-19 pandemic was just peppered all throughout this particular report, for obvious reasons. I'm curious, with some of the regression that we've seen in places like the United States and Europe, do we think that it's the COVID-19 pandemic was one of the big stressors that's causing some of that regression?
I think we saw it more in places that rely heavily on tourism. I think is where we've seen the biggest changes. So it's countries and cities where there's a lot of tourism in the region, because that whole travel and tourism industry was just brought down to nothing really. And just as a reminder, we launched our 2020 report just right before the pandemic, or right actually in the first couple of months, although the data was based on recent data just prior to the beginning of the pandemic. So we were probably way up here in terms of the the bar at that point. And I think that during the COVID pandemic, we saw things really drop off, and now only are just beginning to see things, move back to a more quote unquote normal state. But it was definitely economically, I think, those cities I was mentioning before in Latin America really got hit a lot by the lack of the inability to travel during that period. And I think that's why we saw those cities drop to some degree, and it's more based on the economic indicators rather than the LGBT indicators. And that's sort of what saved their ranking was the fact that their LGBT rankings increased.
Gotcha. Okay. So we're curious that with some of the regression that we are seeing, it sort of feels like this is the beginning of those red flags. Are you seeing red flags for the community as a whole? And if so, how do you think what do you think their appropriate response is right now for those of us in the UK, Europe, North America?
Sadly, I think it's everywhere. I mean, there still is so much work to be done. And I think that there's so many countries where the rights are still pretty awful. Open for Business even did a report on Uzbekistan last year or the year before last, which is one of the worst places for LGBT people in the world. So, I mean, there's definitely a lot of backsliding in places like that, in places like Russia, in places like Hungary, which has just recently, passed some very draconian laws. And the sad news is that a lot of other countries see this in that region and start to think about, some of the legislators there are thinking, well, maybe we should bring this kind of, legislation to our country as well. Mm-hmm. Luckily, I think, at the same time, there's still been a more liberal faction that's pushing on, reform and openness and realizing, that there is an economic issue here as well, and that if countries are taking these actions, there are going to be repercussions. Mm-hmm. So, I think we just really try to encourage cities and countries to look at the data and at the positive attributes of what it can be and what cities and countries can be. I mean, Amsterdam was #1 in our rankings this year. I mean, it's no surprise. It's been traditionally a city that's just built on trade for hundreds of years, and it's traditionally been a city that has been open and welcoming to queer people and other minorities for many years as well. So it was not a surprise that they made it to the top of the list again. Actually, it's the second time running.
As you're speaking, I'm just thinking about we did have Paul Donovan on the show, and he talked about the fourth just your blank the
industrial
revolution. Yeah. And his argument was that, he could see that LGBTQ folks would be sort of the scapegoats for some of the problems that individuals, cities, countries were dealing with. And I think when you couple the pandemic with inflation, that is a global issue right now, along with the struggles that the Ukraine war is having on the rest of the world, and other challenges that the globe is facing. Do you see a risk of that, of Paul's theory becoming true?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of, scapegoating is sort of, what's really been the biggest challenge for LGBT people over the years. And I think, especially places like Hungary that I was mentioning before, we will see, authoritarian leaders using the community as a way, using the issues facing LGBT people as a wedge issue in politics, and we just see that happening more and more in so many countries. So yes, I mean, obviously, it takes a lot for for policymakers and business leaders to be educated in this area, and it just takes a lot of time and energy. And it's great that we have groups like yours that are sharing our message. Maybe it's more to the converted choir, but at least I think it's a new way. What we see about this way of looking at LGBT inclusion from a financial perspective, it just begins to open a lot of eyes, basically, to how cities can be more open and more welcoming. And I think it gets an ear in places like Poland, like I mentioned before, that tend to be very practical. I think the Polish, the Poles have very ambitious economic goals and want to be move closer to their Western European counterparts in terms of quality of life and GDP and incomes and things like that. So they're really working very hard to do it. And I think that this argument really helps, especially in those environments where the economic aspirations of a country are really strong, and where if we have some good speakers and supporters of our work through the coalition members that we have, and especially including Accenture, which was, I neglected to say, the sponsor of this report, so thank them for all of this. When you have business leaders who are speaking out on these issues in these cities, then things start to happen, and that's what we're excited about.
What you're just mentioning brings up the question of, are you possibly seeing that these countries are trying to prevent a brain drain because they know that they are losing more likely creative, intelligent, ambitious individuals because LGBT folks are leaving the country because they go get educated somewhere else, and then they're like, there's no way in hell I'm going back to that place because of all the freedoms that I experienced when I was in school somewhere else, whether it's London, the United States, or wherever the case may be.
We have a lot of data on that from our reports that we did in the Caribbean last year, and also the report that we did in Central and Eastern Europe that I wrote last year as well. And in that report, what's interesting in the countries we focused on in Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, and Romania, we did an analysis of data collected by LinkedIn and the World Bank on what we call jobs of the future. And we saw in those countries that the brain drain was very strong, and that it was people were leaving to go to more open, from our rankings, much more open societies, and they were coming into these countries from much less open societies. So you see it, these jobs are then, the people are being replaced, so to speak, by people coming from much less open societies, and that's not a good sign, and that doesn't help an economy grow.
Yeah,
and we hear it all the time too. Just sorry to say, from like Poland, we just had a summit in Warsaw in June of this year with a number of business leaders who were talking about this. And the head of Google in Poland said that they have 100 open jobs sitting there right now, and they have to compete internally with their other offices across Europe, because people will say, oh, do I want to work in Poland? Isn't Poland the place with these terrible LGBTQ free zones?
Right. I think for folks, the vast majority of our audience are US based, and it just makes me think about the same thing happening in cities and states where people, traditionally LGBT folks have gravitated to some of the larger cities because of safety or because of quality of life, and that has left many of these cities with a brain drain. Right? They don't have the size or the breadth of diversity that a lot of other places have. It's a good lesson for us, but it's also, I think, a reminder of what can happen, because if we drain the area too much, then what we're left with is the individuals who will raise the red flags. The polarization that we see happening in these places is oftentimes because we have people going to more inclusive places and leaving behind an echo chamber.
Yeah. So I guess
Exactly.
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just, I mean, I totally agree. And, what we see, I mean, in countries or states or however you want to look at it, is that the people who are there really want to have a good quality of life. A lot of people don't want to get up and move and are working hard to ensure that they have a good quality of life and fighting for their rights and to have, more freedoms that have been declined, that they've been declined over the years. And so we definitely see, and I call these people patriots wherever they are, who are, working really hard to make those kind of changes.
It's interesting because I'm thinking about it's election day, midterm election day here in the United States. So it's been a very volatile midterm election, not, more so than in the past. And there's a lot of talk about Donald Trump announcing tonight or in the next several hours that he's going to run again. And I've heard it before during the Bush years and whatnot. Many liberal colleagues and friends would say, we're going to leave the country. We're going to go north. We're going to go to Europe, whatever. And it was more bombastic and performative. But the last couple of years, with the increasing risk that Trump would run for president again and possibly win, we've heard more people talking about that on the down low. They were quiet. Hey, my spouse and I, we just went down to Mexico to check things out to see if we need to go. We're just doing our homework, or we're checking out the golden visa over in Europe. But they're not talking about it as loudly, and it almost feels like people are taking it more seriously.
Planning. They're moving towards planning rather than
just going
discussion.
on Facebook and like I said, being bombastic. So I guess what your point is, I think what you're alluding to, David, is somebody has to stay in these locations to help fight for those rights. But some people are also thinking to themselves, I'm tired, I'm 50, I'm 60, I'm whatever the case may be, or I've been fighting this all my life. I want to go to where I don't have to fight anymore. And I guess what you're getting at is what is that healthy balance, right?
Right. I think there's and to be honest, I think this is where corporations can play a huge role, right? Is there, if there is no economic viability in these places where they're closed for business, then those places end up suffering. And so the role of the corporations and telling corporations these cities are open for business, I think this is really what we're getting at here is, right, does Google want to, or does Amazon or wherever, do they want to put put something in Little Rock, Arkansas? I'm just throwing a city out there. No offense to folks in Little Rock, Arkansas, but are you going to move to these? Are these corporations going to move to these places because they know they're going to have a list of 100 open jobs sitting there for how long? Because people won't move there because they just cannot stomach moving there.
I totally hear you. I think one of the tools that we use at Open for Business is a report we developed a few years ago called Channels of Influence, which talks about the ways that companies can externally show their support for LGBT inclusion and what they can be doing. And I think that's super important now in these places, like you're saying, like in Poland or in Arkansas or wherever it may be, where there's more support needed for LGBT rights. And that includes things on the external side of advocacy, so the very bottom line about speaking out and speaking with policymakers about this issue. B, looking at supply chains and, are your supply chains, and that's also a big issue for a lot of companies. So they may be based in a larger urban liberal city, but they may have a lot of supply chains and factories in places that are not so welcoming. And what kind of policies and practices can you put into place in those places that will help these companies become more open and willing. We look at where companies are making investments. We also talk a lot about, and especially in Europe, where I think it's even much more important, it's donating to LGBT causes. I think is a huge issue because and supporting the community, because I think especially in Europe, I was just shocked when I got here about how small the budgets are for so many organizations that are
Oh, really?
really providing huge amounts of services. So for example, I know like even in Paris, the LGBT center there is just, man, the only person on staff is a part-time volunteer, who runs
For
this
Paris, which
organization
is
with,
massive.
yeah, exactly, shocking, to hear these kinds of stories. Um, and then the last piece of the channels of influence, again, is about industries, going to your industry organizations as a company and speaking out on these issues, raising these issues with your partners and peers, because that's especially in more challenging locations that I mentioned, in countries that are more challenging. It's when companies can speak to each other peer to peer and talk about these issues. And that's when we start to see real excitement and movement from a lot of like the roundtables that we've had with companies. We start to see a little bit of spark and people saying, you know what, we need to do more. Let's talk. What are you guys doing? What are you guys doing? And this is where companies actually come together more than they compete, because they really want to improve their standing in terms of inclusion.
So with the additional data that's showing the correlation between inclusivity and economic viability, innovation, quality of life in different locations, all that, and the work of course that Todd Sears is doing at Out Leadership with the return on equality and MV Lee Badgett's correlation to direct GDP performance and inclusion. Do you ever, when a country on your list drops, do you ever get a city on your list drops, do you ever get a response? Do people, do cities or local politicians or anybody who say, uh-oh, what did we do wrong? Or how did we drop in this list, or any sort of response?
Well, it's interesting. Just to that point, we've gotten a lot of press and media coverage of the reports, and I think especially when traditional media, newspapers and radio pick up on these issues in countries that are performing poorly, it is that reminder of the, as the press is, it's a great job of that the press does to show that there is an opportunity here. And, of course, we get backlash from, people on the right who think it's, LGBT people aren't special, all these other things. Why are you doing this? What's your problem? Blah, blah, blah. But we also have seen some, cities. We've actually worked with an American city a few years ago that was very interested in how they could improve their ratings. And we talked about, what that might look like and how they can promote this, and I think that we're seeing that a lot more now when cities are competing for whether it's a sports venue or a concert or a relocation of a corporate venue or something like that. We definitely see there's much more of a willingness to show how they're supporting LGBT and other minority populations in the region.
How do you, when you do receive responses from those on the right saying that, well, this report doesn't mean anything, LGBTQ people aren't special, how do you respond to that?
Typically, we don't respond because I think that responding may set us off in the wrong direction.
Haters gonna hate.
So I think we let it go. I think, I think it's I mean, I've read some of the comment sections and some of the publications, when they're quoting Open for Business research in some, right-wing publications in other countries. And yeah, it's just, I don't think that there's really an opportunity to argue in some of these cases.
Because I don't even know that it's necessarily about LGBTQ people specifically. I mean, yes, I think different communities bring different qualities, and that our community has different qualities that value that we can provide the broader society. But isn't it more even just about inclusion and letting people have the freedom to be who they are, so they can be in an environment where they can be creative and be themselves and feel open to even to the point of feeling like I'm in a safe space that I can throw out this business idea and know that I'm not going to get completely excoriated for it, but that people are open to anything at the with the goal of, you know, improving the bottom line, whether that's the company, the city, or the country.
Oh, exactly. I mean, one of the things, we look, Open for Business has what we three levels of indicators that we look at in our global research. So we look at the economic level, we look at the business level, and we look at the individual level. And that individual level is, about things like what you were just saying, being your authentic self, going the extra mile. When you feel comfortable every day going into your office, and don't feel you have to hide, who you spent the weekend with, or the fact that you have kids with your same-sex partner, or whatever it might be. People are just much happier and more productive overall. And so we definitely see that. We typically don't use those arguments so much in our reports, just because we think the economic and business arguments that we have are going to be more effective with the policymakers and business leaders that we want to reach.
Well, to
But it's
logical
certainly,
people.
yeah.
Well, and I think
What's that?
that's,
I said to logical people.
and I think that's the point,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
When you're talking about whether it's authoritarian or theocratic type of governments or regimes, they don't want anybody to rock the boat. They don't want anybody to get off the path. They want everybody to be marching in one direction, right? And so anything that looks slightly like it could challenge their, or lead somebody to think that they could challenge them, they want to shut it down pretty quickly. And that's why those regimes and countries are probably happy and proud of the fact that they rank pretty low.
Yeah, I don't know if there's no one's been actively saying, "Oh my God, we're number, 145 on the Open for Business list." I don't think there's been much activity in that regard. I think it's just more, indifference more than anything else from these countries. Um, but we get noticed. When we did a report right before Hungary passed this very draconian law about, very similar to what's in Russia about, media, portrayals of LGBT people in media and things like that. We put out a business brief and we got some press for it. And interestingly, we saw that the government, was reading these and commenting. The government's official media sources were actually, commenting on the report, and so they definitely, we know that we're being seen by important people. And the same thing happened in Poland when we came out with our report last year. We found that the chargé d'affaires, who's the acting ambassador in Warsaw at the U.S. Embassy, quoted our report in a major policy speech that he gave to his Polish counterparts. So we're definitely, getting into under the skin a little bit of these leaders, whether they like it or not. And so I think they can't, it's like you can't avoid the truth. How far can you go with to avoid the truth is the bottom line. So we're just hoping that we're going to get to a place that's going to be a little stronger, that more countries will start to realize this and listen more than not listen.
So with that, what more can the community, the LGBTQ community globally do to share lists like Open for Business and other lists that show the value, the economic value and other values of being more inclusive of LGBTQ people and of all people?
Well, I think especially if you work for a large company that has what we, employee resource group for queer people, I think it's wonderful to take this information to them. If you're working with that local activist groups in your area, and you're thinking about what you could be doing. I think it's really important to look at this data, and even if your city is not covered, as you said, because we can't cover every city, but I think you can, let's say, you have a pretty good sense of where your city stands economically and on LGBTQ issues. We haven't done anything breathtakingly new here. We're using existing data sources for both of our LGBT and economic indicators. What we're doing that's interesting is just bringing it together and giving a more composite rating for cities than we've seen before. But I think that everyone can start to have these conversations in their own communities, and I think when we were talking before about things slipping back, especially in the U.S., what can be done? We know that in places like Dallas and in Houston, where at the state level, there have been some pretty crazy laws coming through on trans issues and parents and all of that, and these cities are not following in that. They're standing up, and that doesn't happen automatically. Sometimes, yes, there will be mayors that are interested in it, but when there's enough push from the community to make these changes, I think it really starts to change things. Right. Similarly, I mean, on the economic side, it's all, when we think about what makes cities competitive, it's, it's innovation, it's entrepreneurism, it's how easy it is to start businesses. And if you're involved in the business community in these areas, you may want to also look at, how good a job is your city doing in these areas as well. So there's definitely opportunities for improvement on both sides of the equation, so to speak.
So share the data.
Yeah.
So exactly. With that, how can our audience get more information on Open for Business as well as your city ratings list for 2022?
Sure. So just one way you can follow us on social media, on Twitter. What we know currently as Twitter, it's at OFB_LGBT. That's relatively easy. Our website is openforbusiness.org, but that's open-for-business.org. If you just Google Open for Business City Ratings, you'll get to our page. So Open for Business City Ratings is the easiest way to get there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, George, for reaching out, sharing the list with us. It's very informative to David and me, and we're excited to keep track of the list as you produce more, because I think it'd be interesting to see how cities evolve. Yeah.
So we are definitely thinking about creating an LGBT business and financial data resources page on the queermoneypodcast.com website, because we have talked about this for a long time. There's been a dearth of data, and we are starting to see more data, and we want to collectively put it somewhere where folks who listen to the podcast and otherwise can find this kind of data. So we'll be linking to it on our website, definitely.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another Queer Money. Here's your takeaway from this episode. Yes, there's a moral case and a human rights case for LGBTQ plus equality, but we also need to be able to speak the language of the economic case so we can spread equality for more people to more places.
Learn the language of LGBTQ plus economic equality. A good start is Open for Business's 2022 City Ratings, which is linked to in your podcast player.
Then join us Thursday for another bonus episode of Queer Money and our regular scheduled show next Tuesday.
Thank you, and have a great week.